Hello, I'm here with Captain Kevin Smith. I'm Sue Smith, his wife, and we're going to have a discussion about his work and some of his significant career milestones. We're inviting everyone to listen in. Though we would like to tell our radio audience that the full video and audio of this conversation will be available on Kevin's website, throttleUpRadio.com, and his YouTube channel, Throttle Up Radio. So, Kevin, tell everyone why you wanted to have this conversation and make this video.
Okay, good question. First of all, I'm glad to be here, and thank you for being here as well, helping out and keeping me on track. I think probably two reasons. Number one is that there's a continuing or new interest, perhaps not just continuing, but a new heightened interest in two areas that I see in this country. One of them is a recognition of the need for leadership, the need for effective leaders, leaders that can help us through difficult times. Oh, and the second reason is the renewed interest in the new Top Gun movie. The Top Gun movie trailer has just been released to rave reviews. It's gone viral on YouTube. And many people have seen it. I think in 2 days it had more than 20 million hits. And I was involved in that initiative, that Top Gun initiative. And so probably it's time for me to talk about my involvement and how the Top Gun program sort of propelled and supported and helped other interests and other things that came after it. Some of it is the work that I have done and the work of others. And so I guess you can say I'm within that group of people that were involved and responsible for that initiative being successful, and how we could use that, leverage that to help other programs.
Will you tell us a little bit about the start of your Navy career?
Yes. I guess you could say that I started out as a sonic warrior. And what does that mean? I got involved when I was going through the Naval Air Academy as a student naval aviator, learning to fly Navy airplanes. I eventually got into the supersonic pipeline. I'm not exactly sure how I wound up there. It wasn't available for everyone, but nevertheless, I was selected to go through the supersonic pipeline, and so one of the airplanes that they used for initial supersonic training happened to be the F-11 Tiger. And that was the first supersonic airplane that was ever built, the world's first supersonic airplane. And I got to fly that in various modes and the various mission realistic training scenarios. And so I guess you're going to ask me, what was it like to fly supersonic airplanes?
Yes, exactly.
I would say that that it was like certainly a thrill a minute, but it was also challenging. The bottom line is that I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved it. These airplanes were highly maneuverable, very, very fast, and just a joy to ride. Ride like you would ride a motorcycle or ride a fast horse. So we were in that mode of thinking. But of course, it was quite challenging too. And one of the challenges that we had was we had to figure out how to actually perform aerial combat at sonic speeds. It had never been done before. And so we were working in that area. A lot of it was trial and error. There wasn't much in the way of corporate knowledge or best practices. We were basically on the ground floor trying to figure it out as best we could.
How does the gun sight HUD figure into those challenges?
Yeah, that was probably one of the major challenges that we had. Now, the HUD, head-up display, of course, was invented during World War II for the propeller-driven fighters of that day. But then when we got into the jet era and we got into the supersonic era, the head-up display was modified to become more dynamic, and so it was a gyro stabilized gun sight. So it had gyroscopic information. It wasn't just fixed. The problem, though, was this. The airplane flying characteristics when it goes supersonic were entirely different. And so it was like flying two different airplanes in the same fuselage. Now, flying characteristics were different for lots of reasons. A lot of them are, physics, scientific, and stuff like that. Fact remains is that it became a different airplane characteristically. And the gyro stabilized head-up display wasn't smart enough at the time to understand that. And so the supersonic regime was such that whatever information that we had to aim our guns wasn't effective.
Now, this was during your training. You were running into this issue. Is that correct? Or
Right.
I'm just trying to understand.
Right. And so what I did is I realized very quickly that you had to disregard the information and you had to be able to anticipate what the airplane was going to do before it actually did something in the supersonic regime. And the problem was in the engagement, in the air combat engagement, there was a place there in the envelope where you went from supersonic flight back to subsonic because you were pulling a lot of G's. And that transition from supersonic regime to the subsonic regime produced all kinds of control difficulties that you had. And you had to be able to anticipate that before it actually happened. If you didn't anticipate that, the airplane would stall and it would spin out and you would be in serious trouble.
Now, were you using the F-11 Tiger at this point, or are you starting to talk about your career in the F-8 Crusader?
That was the F-11 Tiger. That was the first supersonic airplane that I flew. And then I quickly transitioned into the F-8 Crusader, which was a remarkable airplane, and it stayed in in the fleet operation for a very long period of time. It was very, very advanced airplane. I loved it, by the way. It was carrier based, as it turns out, and it was the first airplane to exceed 1,000 miles an hour. Airplanes I were flying at that time were brand new, and they were delightful and very, very responsive and extremely high performance airplanes.
What time frame was this? What year?
This was mid 1960s is when I started flying the supersonic F-8 Crusader. I'm kind of surprised that a lot of people don't understand the history of aviation, but nevertheless, I think it has an amazing story to tell. The airplane and my involvement, I think, is important as well. The F-8 Crusader was the only airplane that was awarded the Collier Trophy and the Thompson Trophy.
So you're going to explain what those awards meant.
Those awards that basically for lots of reasons, but the Collier Trophy and the Thompson Trophy were awarded to that airplane and the design team because it actually set a number of speed records. Some of those speed records have never been duplicated. Give you an example, one of the things that was extremely important during that period of time was to be able to launch from an airport or an aircraft carrier and climb at an extremely rapid rate to intercept high altitude bombers. And that was one of our major jobs as fighter pilots. The airplane could actually go from zero airspeed to 35,000 feet at Mach 1 in 5 minutes.
Sounds fast.
It's 5 minutes. You can be intercepting the enemy bomber in 5 minutes. It was
off of the carrier.
Off of the carrier, yes.
Amazing.
5 minutes, and it was really quite remarkable. We used to have this maneuver. This is kind of fun, and I used to love to do it. We had this maneuver at that particular point in time when you reach 35,000 feet. The nose of the airplane was so high that it was actually difficult and uncomfortable to push it over because you would go into zero G's and things would fly over the cockpit and you would feel kind of funny and stuff like that. So we used to do what we call the burner roll, where we would actually do an aileron roll and come back to a level flight. So that was kind of fun. I used to love to do that. Okay, so the F-8 was, and to end the discussion on the F-8 and to move on to the next big story was the F-8 was that airplane that had the conventional weapons for a fighter, which were guns. Okay, guns, they were around for a long time, right? Since World War I. So World War I, fighter airplanes had guns, and the F-8 Crusader had guns as well. They were actually pretty big guns. They were 20 millimeter cannons, so they were not machine guns. 50 calibers were machine guns, but the 20 millimeters, they were considered to be cannons. And so we had 4 of them. We had 4 20 millimeter cannons, but also we carried the first generation missiles, which were called Sidewinders. They were heat-seeking missiles. And that made it a formidable weapon system. It was quite well equipped. It was highly respected and very, very effective in combat. Very effective.
So now you were involved with Top Gun, the very beginnings of Top Gun. Why don't you tell the folks about that?
Yeah, that's, that I guess you can say that that was the beginning of my journey, although my journey started as a training to be a sonic warrior, going through the supersonic, first supersonic era. But then Top Gun popped up on the radar, so to speak. And that was because of for two reasons. Number one, the the combat effectiveness of U.S. air forces, the Naval Air Force and the United States Air Force, the combat effectiveness of the tactical fighter program during Vietnam in 1968 was not very good. It wasn't. Very, very poor performance, particularly in the F4 community. And there was a rather critical thing that happened. We could say that it was a crisis that had occurred because it was completely unexpected. We thought that these brand new F4 airplanes, and they were good airplanes, and these are good pilots, but the pilots were not properly trained for the environment, and the airplane wasn't particularly equipped to handle the environment that we were putting the airplane in. And things went downhill very, very rapidly, performance-wise. And so a lot of people hit the panic button. There was some major studies that were done very, very quickly. One famous study is called the ALT report. That probably was the most thorough examination of the problem and the problem space. The solution came from, and I think this is probably more important than anything else. And I think this is a lesson for all of us. The actual solution was originated and came from the grassroots level. It was a grassroots initiative.
The line pilots, is that what you're saying?
Yes. The active pilot community, right? Not the bureaucracy, not the headquarters and all of that stuff. Notwithstanding, I'm not suggesting that the headquarters people were not good people. They were and they are. All right, these are good, solid, officers and very, very capable. But the fact remains is that the fighter pilot that was actually there saw things that were not clearly visible to anybody else because it was a very difficult problem to deal with. And the environment was extremely complex. Remember, back then, we were still learning things about these supersonic airplanes and things about energy management that we didn't know. There is no energy management dial in the airplane, There is no energy management display in the airplane. But we had to understand what our energy was, not only in the present time, but also at some point in the future. So I like to think of it as this. We had to be able to figure out a future situation from a set of current events. Now, that's extremely hard to do cognitively. It can be done, but it can only be done through proper training. You have to be formally trained in order to do that.
And you're talking about the future events that the combat pilot has in his role. I mean, as a combat pilot, you're talking about those,
Absolutely, absolutely right.
Those scenarios.
Yes, absolutely right.
That he has to be able to anticipate
Right.
what is happening.
And be correct about it and be accurate, right? So everything in the cockpit was here in the here and now. We had to be able to take that, and we had to do what I call mental projection. We had to be able to figure out accurately where the enemy airplane was going to be, not where it is now, but where, based upon what our understanding of the performance characteristics of our plane and the enemy's airplane. I used to teach this, right? And I would tell my students that you not only have to fly your airplane, but you actually have to fly the enemy airplane as well. You have to fly both airplanes simultaneously, and you have to be able to anticipate not only where your airplane can be, but where the other airplane will be. So that was extremely important. That was not known up to this point. The other thing was that the missile technology, missiles were new. They were a new thing that humans had just come up with. The original missile was called a Sidewinder, which was actually designed, was actually invented and built by the Naval Air Weapons Center, China Lake. You and I have been to China Lake, and we have done some museum speaking engagements there at their museum. But the Naval Air Weapons Center, China Lake, invented the Sidewinder. That happened to be a very good weapon system, short range. Now, we wanted to go longer range, all right, and so we put longer range missiles on the Phantom, but we didn't give it any guns. So we thought that the Phantom was going to deal with long range intercepts, and because the missiles were going to be able to shoot down the enemy airplane before they got into a close-in combat situation, that was going to be good enough. That turned out to be wrong. It was a wrong assumption. And so the Phantom was faced with what we call close-in air combat, or another term that is used is dogfighting. Okay. The Phantom was faced with close-in, and the crews didn't know how to do that because they weren't trained. I was then asked to help train the crews in close-in air combat actually before they went to Vietnam. Now, up to this point, they were learning on the job once they got to the combat zone, which turned out to be a rather poor solution to a very difficult problem. It wasn't very effective. So the idea was, well, that doesn't make any sense. Let's prepare them for close-in combat before they actually do have to deploy to a combat zone. And my job, I may have been the first pilot assigned to this, my job, and this was grassroots, by the way, right? Because the Phantom community, when I was stationed at Oceana, and you were there with me, remember that? Well, the Phantom community were screaming for training, and they came to my squadron, and we were flying the FA Crusader, and our airplane almost identically matched the enemy airplane in performance, the MiG-21. And so that grassroots effort basically generated this Top Gun initiative. I may have been the first Top Gun pilot assigned to that role. And my job was to train the Phantom crews to perform well and succeed in a close-in combat situation.
And that effort expanded into working with the F-14 community as well.
Yes,
right?
Exactly right. And that would be, I would call that, in terms of my career milestone, that's Top Gun 2. All right. There is actually a Top Gun 2 movie out there too, but this is my actual Top Gun 2 experience. All right. So the second phase of my Top Gun work was working with the F-14. Now, at that time, the F-14 was the Navy's brand new frontline fighter, brand spanking new, $50 million right out of the factory. And again, the grassroots initiative took over, and it became quite apparent that this airplane, while it had pretty good standoff capabilities for a modern fighter, there wasn't a lot of information in the cockpit that could help you in close-in air combat. Okay. So this whole idea of trajectory and energy management, all that stuff, was pretty much left up to the human operator, or the ingenuity and the innovation and creativity of the human, because the machine that was really not very much help. So the F-14 community that was part of Air Wing 9, I was part of Air Wing 9 as well. They went to the Air Wing commander, who happened to be Captain Tony Less, who I think you met him as well.
Right. Yes.
Right. You know Tony. Tony eventually made vice admiral. And he was a very highly regarded Navy pilot, naval aviator, and he was a squadron. He was the Air Wing commander. I was a squadron commander right under him, and he and I got together, put our heads together, and we came up with this idea that we were going to train the F-14 air crews in close-in air combat while on deployment. It's a brand new idea. Now, of course, as you can imagine, a lot of people said it couldn't be done. So that leads me to Top Gun 3. So Top Gun 3 was actually the first deployed Top Gun unit, and I was the commander of the first deployed Top Gun unit, because no one had been able to figure out how to take the Top Gun training program, the training curriculum, and to export it to an aircraft carrier. All right, so that was a brand new idea, way outside the box, and so they worked together. So training the F-14 crews in close-in air combat was an important job that had to be done, because they were not particularly proficient in that area. So what we were trying to do is we're trying to optimize human performance when humans have to perform complex activities. That's what we're trying to do, right? It's not easy. It has to be done, right? We really didn't have any choice. You can't just say, I give up and go home. You're on deployment on a carrier, right? You're the tip of the spear. So we had no choice but to do the best that we possibly could. And so I was the squadron commander of that initiative, of that Top Gun, first deployed Top Gun unit. And as it turns out, we were able to provide meaningful close-in air combat training for the F-14 community in the Pacific Fleet at that time.
You won an award
And yes,
for your efforts,
yes,
right?
Yes, I did. Yes, I was a citation and a medal. So I was I was glad. I mean, a bit humbled about it, but certainly I was grateful that that it was recognized. It was, in fact, quite a difficult challenge, as it turns out. There's a lot of moving pieces there when you try to take this stuff on a carrier. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that could go wrong. Not the least of which you could have some serious accidents. So, um,
Were there things? So, what are the things from these experiences as squadron commander? The issues with for combat training. Uh, what of this did you learn from that you carried forward in uh, your other career, your career outside of the Navy?
well, the first thing that comes to mind is that everything that we thought we knew about uh, performing well in a very dynamic, fluid, complex environment like aerial combat turned out to be wrong. And there's lots of reason for that. And I don't mean that that there were I'm not talking about people were not doing the very best that they could. They all were, but there was a lot of misconception about what actually constituted those things that could optimize human performance. I'll give you an example. I used to take new fighter pilots out and train them in all of these maneuvers, all of these complex, combat maneuvers. And I quickly learned that before I got into any of the specifics of maneuver warfare, I had to address two things right up front, and they were non-technical things. The first thing I had to address is I had to break through the fear barrier. I had to prove to these young pilots that the airplane was not going to kill them, that I was not going to kill them in my close-in maneuvers, and they should not be afraid. The second thing I had to do was I had to make sure that they had enough self-confidence that I could actually train them in these complex maneuvers. So self-confidence was the second thing. Both of those things were non-technical, right? But vital. I mean, if I couldn't do that, I would fail in my job as a Top Gun instructor.
So, do you want to tell us about the F-22 project?
Yeah. Whatever I learned, experienced, and was able to deal with effectively in the area of air combat and the Top Gun initiative that I was involved with for a long period of time, I got involved in the F-22 project. And the F-22 was, of course, the first fifth-generation fighter that we built as a nation. First fifth-generation fighter in the world, as it turns out. And there was a considerable amount of concern because we were going from a crew of two back to a crew of one. Now, of course, the FA Crusader was a crew of one airplane, a single piloted airplane. But the F-4 and the F-14 were a pilot and the naval flight officer in the back, the weapon systems operator. So it was a crew of two. Now we were going back to a single crew member in the F-22, and that was a very, very difficult thing because we had to figure out how to take all of this high technology and package it in a way that a single pilot could operate it effectively. And that was a huge challenge for the industry, a huge challenge for the Department of Defense, and a huge challenge for the research community. We had a lot of research involvement. For example, There was a component of the program that was being funded by DARPA, all right, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, was involved in this initial design efforts. And so I was brought in to help with the cockpit environment, all right, the flight deck, because it had to be designed in a way that it could accommodate a single crew member.
Yeah, and this was after your active duty days, correct?
Right. Yes. I had retired from the Navy, and then I was asked by Lockheed to come in and help them out with the design of the crew station for the F-22.
Right. And you worked on design specs, or
In fact, that's a really interesting question because when I first went in there, everybody thought we were going to deal with whatever information was being presented on the flight on the displays. These were glass. We call them a glass display or a glass cockpit. They were multifunction displays, and so you could throw a lot of information. And so everybody thought that I was going to be dealing with the display features. As it turns out, I did deal with some of the display features, but I quickly realized that there was something else that needed to be done, and that needed to be done before you actually designed the display features. And that was to consider very, very carefully what is your design model by which you are able to create these display features that are agile and adaptive. So, in complex language here, you could say that what I was trying to figure out, or in the design team that I was on, we were trying to figure out how do you actually enable or make the cockpit systems agile and adaptive, right? The challenge was, how do you build a complex adaptive system? Simple, right? That's a simple phrase, but it's extremely difficult to do because the system has to know something that current systems don't. The system has to be able to recognize events before the pilot tells it. So a system has to be working with the flight crew and not after the flight crew has figured things out. The system has to be helping. And so the complex adaptive systems was the challenge. The problem was that the way we figure out the design model that we were using was created during the analog era, and it didn't work for digital systems. It didn't work.
and so you discovered some new models for this.
Well, we had to.
Right.
We had no choice but to come up with a different design model, right? We had no choice. We just, the current design model, which was technology driven, didn't work. It simply didn't work. It was bottom up technology engineering. It didn't work. It worked great for the analog systems, but for digital systems, it didn't work. And the other thing that we were asked to do, and this is extremely important, and probably the most important point. I wish I made this sooner, but the other thing that we were asked to do was somehow you have this digital environment, all right? You are living in a digital world now, and all these systems can actually communicate with one another, right? It was the first airplane that I don't know if you understand the terms here. I'm trying to make them simple, but it's the first data bus airplane.
And what airplane was
This
that?
is the F-22.
The F-22.
Right. So the first data bus tactical airplane, which means it had a 1552 data bus, which would basically meant that all systems could communicate with one another. The problem was if you can do that, then how do you integrate at a higher level? How do you create what we call higher order reasoning capability within the man-machine system? Extremely important to do such a thing. That design model didn't exist, and we had to create it.
And who is we?
The design team I was on. I actually was the gang of five. We were the Mavericks, you know. We were the outliers. You know, we were considered to be crazy. You know, we were the gang of five. You know, we said no, you need a new design model, and so we came up with a new design model. We just didn't say you needed one. We actually created a new design model, which we presented in at the Digital Avionics Systems Conference at the time in San Jose. We presented that.
So on to your next big career challenge. What would you say that was?
Well, the next big career challenge was airline pilot training. So after I finished my work on the F-22, and we did the best we could, we came up with some really good system concepts, and and that went on and did the best that it could. I think it probably could have been better, but that's just the nature of the world. The next big challenge was the 3 a.m. phone call. You probably heard of that. This actually didn't occur quite this way, but close enough. So I got this emergency phone call at 3 a.m. and the guy says, I'm working for a major airline at the time, and I'm just a regular line pilot. And a guy calls me up, a friend of mine, and says, when can you get to the training center of this airline, because all hell is broken loose. And I said, I don't know. When do you need me? He says, yesterday. I said, well, that's pretty quick. What's going on? He says, well, we're in serious trouble training-wise. So I go up there and they offer me this management position. And so I, you know how I am, right? So I accept the management position.
Anxious to help out.
Anxious to help out. And so I accept the management position and got involved in redesigning airline pilot training. Now, I thought that I was going to be involved with redesigning airline pilot training for this airline. No, not true. The job was to redesign airline pilot training for all airlines. So that meant that I was a member of a federal task force sponsored by the federal government, jointly sponsored by the Air Transport Association. So my job was to redesign airline pilot training for all U.S. carriers. And you're probably going to ask me, how did that work out?
Kevin, how did that work out?
Quite successfully, by the way, and all airlines are now using that training model. All of them, every single one. Most of European airlines are also using the training model. Same one. What was the motivation? What generated this industry-wide initiative? And it was motivated by rising accident rates that were being experienced in the airline industry back in approximately 1987. And a lot of concern within the industry, a lot of concern within federal agencies, and a lot of concern within Congress. And so they put together a blue ribbon task force under the Reagan administration, and the task force came up with a bunch of ideas. And one of the ideas was that the current airline pilot training program was kind of like frozen in time. It was difficult to modify it, and so we needed a new way to upgrade airline pilot training, and so Congress allowed us the flexibility to do that. And it eventually became known as the Advanced Qualification Program Initiative, AQP. And I was a member of the AQP working group, federally sponsored, and also chairman of the Training Integration Task Force. So I was at the very high level, and my job was to figure out how to upgrade airline pilot training and bring it up to the current time frame in terms of airplanes and equipment, but also in our understanding of human performance from a performance and a psychological standpoint, not just from a technical standpoint. So two things emerged from this, and they're very, very significant. And these were huge breakthroughs in thinking. All right. We moved away from a focus, almost exclusive focus on technology, and we said that technology has its place, but it is not the focal point. The focal point is the human and the ability of the human to solve complex problems. The human is supported by technology. The human is supported by psychology, but the human and its ability to understand problems and solve problems, complex problems, very quickly and effectively, that was the focal point. And so we moved everything to the human and the human cognitive system. People don't quite understand what that means. It ought to be fairly common language, but the human possesses a cognitive system that is capable of doing things that otherwise cannot be done. Right? The human has a marvelous system. It is innovative. It is creative. It's adaptive, and it's agile. It has all of those characteristics. The most important thing is that it can solve problems that are difficult to solve. It has great problem-solving capabilities. And so we focused on the human. We got the human as the centerpiece, and we worked on the human side. We brought in all kinds of things, and we also realized that the human thinks about systems and thinks about the mission. And human does not do very well with the lower level stuff.
And so now this is where your work on mission adaptive displays fits in.
Correct. Yes. Right. And so what we've discovered was that if you really want to improve performance, no matter what you're doing, no matter what industry you're in, it doesn't, whether or not you are a seasoned professional or you're a beginner or you're a graduate student, it doesn't matter. What we discovered was that in order to improve performance, if you are operating with sophisticated equipment, you have to be able to get the equipment to give you certain things at the right time to help your performance. That's called a performance aid. Right? Now, the beauty of modern technology is that we can change displays features in nanoseconds, right? Remember in the analog era, in the analog era, The display was given, right? It was frozen, but no longer, right? So we can change display features very, very quickly in the digital era. So why don't we get the display features smart enough to figure out what the human needs at that particular time. It's called a performance aid, a real-time performance aid, or another term that I use is mission-ready performance aids.
And so, one of your contributions to your field, aviation, is your textbook on mission adaptive display technologies, right? Where you have made this sort of approach available to the general public.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, and so I was able to. I had an opportunity to write this textbook type. It's a research essentials book published by IGI Global, a large publishing house of technical material. And I was honored to write it. But yes, it is a textbook that we both worked on putting it together, but it's a textbook that deals with mission adaptive displays. Another general term that we use is it deals with mission ready adaptive systems. The title of the book again is Mission Adaptive Display Technologies and Operational Decision Making in Aviation. It's a mouthful, but that pretty well describes what the textbook is all about. Now, what it does is it says, okay, if we are able to technically get the displays to modify themselves with a particular trigger, why don't we do it? All right. And you can say, well, Kevin, are the triggers there in the airplane already, or do you have to build the triggers and all of that stuff? The answer is no, the triggers are there. Right? We just have to recognize that the trigger's there. And then once we have the trigger, can it actually produce a display feature that would be considered to be a performance aid to help the flight crews perform better this complex activity? The answer is yes, you can do that technically. Why don't we do it? Well, we don't do it. It's not because we don't have the technical capability to do that. We do. We don't have the design model that informs that process.
And you have another book that you are very proud of, and that I'm proud of, we're all proud of, your Critical Thinking Essentials. So why don't you tell everyone about that?
Yes, I would be glad to do that. Yes, that's a good lead-in. Critical Thinking Essentials. All right, so I started to write other books as well, and I wrote a number of short books, if you will, and started to do author events, also called book signing events, at bookstores across the country. And so lots of them, private, mom and pop bookstores all the way up to Barnes and Noble. And you've been with me on a number of those events. And I got talking to people. And what I learned from the people I met, and it's a wonderful experience because you never know who's going to walk through the door of a bookstore, right? Because it's a random sample of Americans. And I talked to all of them, and I asked them about themselves, and they tell me about themselves and what they do or what they have done, and what is their interest. Well, their interest was in, above everything else, their interest was, I want to learn how how to think critically, and I want to learn how to do that better.
Well, we're hearing a lot about that from a lot of different sources these days about the importance of uh, critical thinking courses in the colleges. And I would say you've been on the forefront of this activity, this pursuit.
Yes, I mean, you and I went to Europe recently. We had a speaking engagement there in Brussels. Critical thinking is, in fact, well, I'll give you an example, all right, and to prove this point, all right. The World Economic Forum meets in Davos, Switzerland every year. Am I pronouncing that properly?
Davos, I think.
Is it Davos, Switzerland? And they put out a report. So the latest Future of Jobs report put out by the World Economic Forum says that critical thinking and complex problem solving are the number one sought after skill set in the global job market, and also the most difficult to fill. All right, I rest my case. I mean, what else can I say? And the people I meet all across, in fact, you and I just came back from a author event at Barnes & Noble in Idaho Falls, 2-day event. It was a big 2-day event. And we learned once again that people are clamoring for more stuff on critical thinking. Now, what I didn't want to do, I didn't want to just hand them this dense book with lots and lots of words and difficult to get through, and it was going to kind of sit on their shelf or their coffee table, and they would thumb through it but pretty much forget it. Right? I was not willing to do that, and there's lots of books like that. Okay, there are. All right, I wanted to do something different, something out of the box. So I thought to myself, okay, what do they need? Well, they need something that's easily accessible and effective. That's what they need, all right? So something you can get into quickly, get on with your job, your work, your life, and then pick it up again whenever you have the need for it. The way I like to explain it, and I do this with everybody I meet, is that this is part of your go bag. All right, this handbook. All right, it's part of your go bag. What is your go bag? Your go bag in the military, we always had one packed, right? Because you never knew when you were going to get called up and fly to the ends of the world to solve a crisis. But the go bag is when your organization or personally you have a crisis and you have to go someplace to solve it. That's part of your go bag. All right, that sits right next to your DOP kit. All right, you take that with you.
The critical thinking
handbook.
essentials
you take
handbook.
That with you when you go out to solve a critical problem. That's it. All right, and it takes you through the steps that you need to take. And one of the biggest problems we have is we tend to jump ahead without spending some quality time on defining the problem. What is the problem for which you seek a solution? A famous quote from Einstein, and I don't actually know if this is true, but I use it because it sounds good, and I think it is true. Somebody asked Einstein this hypothetical question. They said, if you had an hour to figure out how to save the world from annihilation, what would you do? How would you spend your hour? And he said, I would spend 55 minutes of that hour trying to figure out the problem. And the rest is simple mathematics. That was his answer.
Well, mathematics right now are telling us that it is time to close our discussion.
Really?
And I want to say, on behalf of our family, Thank you for your service to our country and your contributions to your profession and your ongoing contributions to learning and this great effort of better thinking, critical thinking. So, thank you, sweetheart.
And thank you. And I've enjoyed it immensely.
Well, me too.
Yes, it's been fun.